Thanks so much, everyone, for attending this panel. So we have a great list of speakers, and we're going to talk about the impact of the 2024 proxy season, which I guess just ended, on off-season engagement, which would include the period from now until the next proxy season. So my name is Josh White. I am a finance professor at Vanderbilt University's Owen Graduate School of Management. I'm currently on leave. I'm a senior advisor at the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, the PCAOB. So I have to give a disclaimer that my views do not represent those of the PCAOB, the staff, or the board members, and they may not represent my own views. Might change my mind. I'll reserve that right. So my history before I joined Owen in 2017, I was a financial economist at the SEC. I was associated with them from 2012 to 2018, also on the faculty of the University of Georgia. I have a published paper that was literally accepted or published yesterday on shareholder engagement. So good timing. Go read it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Actually, Mike, I think, tweeted it. So if you follow Mike's Twitter feed. So I'm excited about this panel because it really meets sort of research and practice. We've got a great list of speakers, and I'll just sort of go in order here. We have Alfredo Porretti. He is the managing director and global co-head of shareholder engagement and M&A capital markets at JP Morgan. In New York. And so in this capacity, Alfredo provides a variety of services to companies, including proactive engagement with institutional investors, key stakeholders, activism defense, addressing ESG issues. And I'm sure ESG will come up on this panel. So we're excited to have Alfredo. Teresa Sebastian is the founder, president, and CEO of the Dominion Asset Group. She's also on several boards. I had to keep track because there were so many. I think I got the right number. There's AES Corporation.
I'm not overboarded.
I was implying talent, not overboarded. Okay. AES Corporation, Kaiser Aluminum, and Peckham Industries. Teresa is also a former senior vice president, general counsel, corporate secretary, and the chief compliance officer of Darden Restaurants. And she has extensive experience developing and executing robust shareholder outreach programs, and is also affiliated with the NACD Nashville chapter, which we're excited to have them here today. And then we've got Mark Borges. So Mark is a principal at Compensia. He's been there for 17 years. His role is largely advising boards about compensation committees, executive compensation, corporate governance issues, and any kind of related disclosure matters. Compensia provides a range of advisory services to comp committees and senior management around things like shareholder outreach, governance, and compensation packages. So we're excited to have all three of you. Excited to talk about shareholder engagement, and we'll just dive right into some of the questions. And actually, I'll start at the end, Mark. I want to back up and talk about sort of the history of shareholder engagement before we talk about what are the hot topics right now. And I know there was this thing that came out of Dodd-Frank called Say on Pay, which doesn't really give investors a say on pay. It gives them an advisory vote on pay. Academic studies have shown that didn't really affect pay, but maybe it affected shareholder engagement. So could you talk just a little bit about that?
Let me just spend a short amount of time on this because Teresa is going to talk a little bit about the world as it existed before Say on Pay. But what Say on Pay did was codify, although on an advisory basis, the ability of shareholders to provide feedback to the company on their executive compensation program. And if you traced back long enough, you'll find that this was a constant problem between shareholders and the companies in which they invested. There was very little communication, and the whole point behind this rule was to require companies to provide information about the thinking behind their executive compensation decisions and potentially promote a dialogue between those two parties. And in fact, it took a few years, but now that Say on Pay has been around for, I think, 17, 18 years, it's in fact done that. And what's most interesting is that while things started out focused on executive pay, that's not become the only topic that is discussed these days. And in fact, most of the issues in Say on Pay have been ironed out, and this engagement idea has now extended to other areas that we're going to be talking about, including corporate governance and things like that. And today we have an environment where most companies have a regular ongoing dialogue with their shareholders about issues of mutual concern.
No, I think that's helpful. So Teresa, on that,
Yeah.
I'll let you go.
So I've been in the corporate world, for a number of decades. And when I was on the finance side, I was in the capital markets world. But then when I decided to become a lawyer was the same time when 14AA became a thing, became the rule. And it gave our shareholders an opportunity to more directly engage and have a presence in the proxy. And so they would submit shareholder proposals. And the companies had to look at those and decide, and there's some exceptions, but decide whether it's appropriate to go into the proxy. And of course, again, the SEC created certain exclusions that companies could rely on to keep that proposal out. Well, practically speaking, what was going on in the background, though, was that when we would get those shareholder proposals in, we would call up the shareholder and talk to them about that proposal. And many times we could get an agreement to modify certain governance practices and get the shareholder to withdraw their proposals. And that was really the goal. If we wanted to take it one step further, we could submit the matter to the SEC. But that was kind of 14AA gave more direct engagement with shareholders. On the institution side, what was happening is that many institutional investors were creating governance departments following on that. And that allowed the company to have a certain individual or a department of individuals that they could call. So again, back in the early 90s was when really the whole concept and formalization of shareholder engagement started with 14A8 and shareholder proposals.
Thank you. Thanks for that sort of color on where we ended up and sort of today's shareholder engagement environment. So I want to talk about, you'd mentioned reaching out to investors, whether they submitted a proposal or whether you're just being more proactive. And I'll ask this to any of the panelists, but we can start with you, Alfredo. How can boards use off-season engagement to build stronger relationships, especially with those investors they think are really key to their shareholder base?
Sure. So I have to give you the same disclaimer. All opinions are my own. They don't represent the views of JP Morgan. Sorry, but I always have to say it when I speak publicly. But answering the question, I think it is an important moment for shareholders to build rapport with with the managements and boards of companies and vice versa. And I do think it's an important moment. If you think about most public companies, they will speak to their largest shareholders 4 times a year around the earnings, but there's a whole set and an increasing and growing set of investors, as we heard in the prior panel, that are index in nature. And so we'll not make a decision based on the specific performance of a business quarter by quarter, and we'll have more of an overarching view, often informed by ESG thematics. And so in general, one time a year towards the fall season, which is the season we're entering now, there will be this moment, this opportunity for a subset of the management team and board representation to interact with a set of these investors, certainly the index funds, and to some extent, some of the large asset managers and traditional asset managers that have a governance component to their dialogue that generally meets with the representation from the company in conjunction with the PM who has made the decision. And I think it is an important moment for dialogue because it allows boards and management teams to kind of present their story and present their perspective on the companies, the priorities, and how they're thinking about the board dynamics and the management of the business and strategy ahead of any issue, and also to ingrain in the minds of shareholders that matter enormously but do not engage on a frequent basis with them, the framework under which they have to think about the story.
2 quick points. When I started out, or when Say on Pay started out, engagement was viewed as a one and done type thing. You didn't need to engage with your shareholders unless you got in trouble. Either you failed Say on Pay or you had significant opposition suggesting there was unrest among your shareholder group. But if you look at the materials that are out there today, particularly among groups that are advocating engagement, it's all about relationships. The idea is to establish a relationship with your key investors so that you can have this ongoing dialogue. So it's less about, oh, well, we made a mistake or we need to find out what that, how to solve that, to wanting to have an ongoing discussion so that you can get feedback from them on things that companies are doing. They can ask companies about, as Alfredo said, strategy and operations of the business. And you can take the temperature of your shareholder base on what are the important issues of consideration to them. The other thing that I would just mention, and I think he did it a little bit better than I would, we've started to see in my business companies, particularly at the large end of the spectrum, the large cap companies, holding off-cycle meetings with their key shareholders just to talk to them. So, I mean, it's involved into this, kind of regular check-in on a quarterly basis. The thing I would mention is that things tend to percolate down. It always happens with the large cap companies, and then you start seeing the mid cap companies begin to take it over because it's considered good governance practice. So we're kind of at the point now where this is really starting to happen in an accelerated way as these arrangements gain traction.
Yeah. And so from a board perspective, my experience and what I like to see within my boards is to use that time kind of to evaluate, okay, how did the last proxy season go? Were there any areas of tension or threats? Also looking at who are your major shareholders? Are they making any changes to their voting guidelines or policies? And how is that going to affect us in the next proxy season? So it's more about a chance for boards to be, somewhat proactive. And I also want to specifically mention a 2017 letter that came out of Vanguard, and they talked about the 4 pillars of effective governance. And one is looking at your governance structure. That's something that I'm doing at one of our boards right now. We're doing a risk assessment of our entire governance structure. And that is just to be, again, to anticipate where we may have some risks with specific institutional, and not just institutional, because when we think of institutional, we think maybe of mutual funds or PE firms or anyone like that, but also think about, some of the pension funds that may hold big blocks of your shares, like the CalPERS or the New York State Comptroller, and, all of these others. And then there are the little gadfly type shareholder activists. I won't name them, but we all know who they are. I started to name them, but I'm not going to do that. But they can cause, they can take up your time by submitting these common shareholder proposals that you see, almost blanketed out across all companies. So those are some of the things that, that you can do. And also, besides just your shareholders, some of the proxy advisory firms like ISS. I've been involved in talking to ISS before because, well, at the time we were having, some challenges to one of my company's governance structures. And so we took some time to evaluate and talk to ISS, as well as, look at all of what their voting recommendations are. So this is a really good time just to do some homework and introspection as a board to say, okay, how do we want to move forward from here? And what's the right position for us? What's our risk tolerance when it comes to governance? as well.
Oh, thank you. I think those are all important points. And I actually might want to ask one quick follow-up. So you mentioned some of the big indexers such as Vanguard, State Street, BlackRock. I know they have their own engagement teams and they can't meet with all portfolio firms because there's so many. From your own experience, what do you do if you reach out to an investor group and they don't really want to meet? They don't want to be part of either that annual or quarterly discussion. What's a way that you can try to engage with them without physically meeting?
I mean, you can still offer to send them. At one of my companies, when I was general counsel, we had a deck, that took any investor through our governance structure, what are some of the key things, whether they're in our bylaws or policies or otherwise. So if they don't want to talk, and some of them say, we just met with you last year, we're good, and they can't see everybody that reaches out because like other companies, they have limited staff. So if you're not, one that they're concerned about, just send them your deck, your governance deck, and focus them on anything that may be new from the last time they met with you. But again, you do anything that you can just to keep that connection and keep that communication line open. Also, you want to know, have they changed their staff? Because maybe someone that you've talked to for the last 5 years, has moved on to something else and they have someone new in. So that person may say, no, I don't want to meet with you now, but still send them something and say, well, great, we'll follow up with you next year. And also, you don't have time necessarily to meet with every investor. So sometimes hearing that they don't want to meet with you is kind of a good thing.
The important point is contact.
Yeah.
You should not just sit idly by, but contact people because you will get the kind of responses that Teresa was describing. And again, it focuses on developing a relationship. This keeps that momentum moving.
I think a couple of additional items is one, it is even just the acknowledgement that they don't want to meet with you is a positive. And so important to always make sure that you're aware of how you rank the responses you get. Obviously, the meeting is the ideal, but there's other suboptimal answers that are still very good from your perspective because it means there's no major issue. Number two, I would say it is part of, and I spend a lot of time on this, part of it is on the company to try to entice the dialogue. If you know what these teams care the most about and you've had novelty in your company that pertains to those areas, being able to highlight them in a crisp, effective way so that you can kind of get ahead of the list of 3,000 people that they would love to meet if they had time is another kind of angle that you can take. And then the third one is, as in many things, just persistently and systematically approaching the matter is important because you might get 3 of the no thank you mentions that Teresa just said, but then the 4th time you're going to get your chance. And so being systematic and I wouldn't say relentless, but diligent in the approach tends to yield very good results. So I always hear from even large caps that say, oh, we tried a couple of times and then we just dropped it. And I always advise them to do things differently, to keep on with that momentum, because the silence is not a negative, but it's on you to try to continue and maintain that dialogue, as Mark was indicating earlier.
Sort of implicit in everything we're saying is that the days of not knowing your shareholders and understanding their policies, understanding their concerns, their voting patterns, what's of importance to them are over. And the SEC over the last several years has made it easier to track voting records of big institutional investors. I think we won't spend a whole lot of time on this, and I don't want to dwell on it, but the expectation is that you've done your homework. You know who your key investors are, you know what resonates with them. And this whole process of engagement sort of operates on the assumption that you're an informed person or an informed company who knows something about the companies that have your stock. And as a result, you know what their hot buttons and key issues are. And then you can make your strategic decisions about, well, where are we going to concentrate our resources this year based on that information.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So that's extremely helpful. I think to strategize around engaging with shareholders. So I want to want to talk a little bit about the shareholder engagement team itself and sort of how you put that together. Teresa, I know you
Mhm.
have some rich experience here. So can you just talk about
Yeah.
who should decide on that and the role the board plays?
Well, first of all, the who should decide that is, usually your C-suite team. And especially your IR leader who is kind of one of the primary interfaces with your shareholders. But it kind of also depends, on which shareholder you're going to see. Generally speaking, your team is going to be your CEO, your CFO, your head of IR, and your GC. That's kind of the core team. However, there's some institutions and more institutions now want a board member at that meeting as well. Back in the day when we were first starting to do this, it was just, management. And it was like, nope, no board members should be going. We don't want to give them access to you. But shareholders now really do more and more do want to see a board member. And typically it would be, your lead director or your chair if the chair is, a non-executive person. And then the other board member, if any were to go, should be the chair of your nom and gov. And again, we are assuming that this visit with your shareholder is for purposes of talking about governance. So your nom and gov chair would be another candidate to go. The other thing that is really, really critical is making sure that everybody's aligned on the message. You don't want your board members saying anything different than what management has discussed, especially the head of IR has discussed with the shareholders. So make sure that you, have some prep meetings and, our visits would be, pretty much, I shouldn't say scripted, but practiced. We knew how we wanted it to go, and also left time for Q&A, and we knew what our answers, were going to be to some of the questions. But again, you need to structure your team according to the preference of your shareholder and, to the message that you want to present. And for example, if you know that one of the hot button issues is compensation, then you want to have your HR leader there. If most of the issues are going to be, things around your general governance structure, then you may not have the HR person, but you would certainly have, your general counsel or corporate secretary there.
In my experience, the most successful engagements are scripted, but then you throw away the script. You don't go in and read from a piece of paper. Keeping the engagement team small is also great. You don't want to cast at thousands, but as Teresa's mentioned, you need to understand who needs to be there for the issues that you're likely to discuss. And that gets to the whole question of having an agenda. I think most companies will send, if they've been able to arrange a meeting, they're going to send an agenda ahead of time saying, here are the areas we want to talk about. What would you like to talk about? Here's who we're planning to have come. Who's going to be coming from your side? And then the last thing that's verboten is do not bring your outside counsel or compensation consultants or accountants or grandmother or anybody like that to the meetings. They want to hear from the company. And as Teresa said, directors have become more important. The thing to make sure, though, is that people are prepped and that people are ready. Just is your comp committee chair, is your non-gov committee chair someone who can effectively explain what it is that you want to discuss? So the last thing I'll say is, who's going to answer what question? And the big one, if you get thrown a curveball question, who's going to take that? Because inevitably something like that can happen. And I mean, having all those things worked out ahead of time makes for a much smoother process.
And just as a quick reminder for, if you're on that team, especially if you're a general counsel, be sure that you remind your directors
Mhm.
about Reg FD, and insider trading and materiality and all of that. So in your prep session, just take some time to make sure that no one trips up. And even remind your internal, executive colleagues that are going on the trip about those issues as well. And that's another reason to have a good prep meeting and a scripted meeting, a scripted program.
Yeah, you don't want to talk about financial performance at all.
Right.
And the other thing, what we see some companies do, at least in the areas of compensation, and now it's starting to leak into the governance area. If you're thinking about making a change, some companies are concerned that, well, if we are going to run right up against FD because we're not sure if it's going to be material information or not, although most of the stuff in an equity plan or executive comp isn't. We're starting to see companies kind of walk things through with proxy solicitors, which will kind of contact the company on a no-names basis and say, hey, we have a client who's thinking about doing X. What's, your view on that? That really hasn't taken hold yet, but it's something that companies do as a way of avoiding some of these more complex legal issues.
And one additional point there, be mindful that when you send the agenda and the attendees, as Mark suggested, you can also get a response back, no, we would rather have Y. So as you're prepping your own team, just mention it, because you never want to be in a position where people are then shocked that the team that we're presenting is changing at the request of the investor. Obviously, you want to change it if they're requesting it, because ignoring their ask would be kind of counterproductive. So just be mindful in terms of management, because all of us have to manage different constituencies. So be aware of that. And Mark didn't mention bankers in his litany. They're slightly more important than grandmothers, but they still should not be in the
Well,
meeting, just in case you were wondering.
I wasn't going to say it. I didn't want to insult Alfredo.
We left out outside counsel as well.
That's
I won't mention
That's
that.
true.
Okay, so let's shift in from the engagement team to who should they meet with? Because you've got some investors that might pull the lever on the investment decision and others that make voting decisions. So how do you balance that?
Well, who do you want to meet with is you primarily want to meet with whoever is guiding or giving the advice on how to vote. And that is what you need to query and find out before the meeting. One thing that was mentioned is find out, who is going to be coming from the other side, from the institutional side. Look up, as we all do before we go to these types of meetings, look up their bio. Also see if you can find out if, it's one thing to make a voting recommendation. It's another for, whoever is casting those votes to take that recommendation. So you just need to understand who is on the other side, because from the company's perspective, you're not going to have any control over that. The institution's going to pick whoever they think is appropriate to be at that meeting with you. You just want to understand who is it and what are their roles, and let's gear our meeting accordingly. But you have to also decide, why are we going to begin with? Are we going for purposes of creating a relationship? Are we going for purposes of explaining to them some recent changes? Are we going with the purpose of just trying to show that we are transparent and we're listening? There were a couple of times when we would go to meetings and we knew who was coming from the other side, but we wanted to be more in a listening mode. And why were we in a listening mode? Because we heard or understood that there were some concerns with certain positions that we had taken from a governance perspective, or there's some challenges on the financial side. We're not there to talk about the financial side, but we want to see if it's affecting their their governance perspective of the company. So sometimes they may send people that are on the financial side or may have some influence there. And we know we just need to do more listening than talking.
And I think on the index side is a bit easier because it's a pretty structured process. You know who's it's going to be, and they have general emails and they will allocate as appropriate. I think on the active side, be mindful of the fact that sometimes what we recommend is to ask the PM that covers you whether they would like to kind of broker the conversation with their governance side versus going straight to the governor's side, because sometimes the PM wants to be in that conversation as well. And so you're having both sides, as we just said, you're not going to be talking much about the financial aspects, but that specific PM cares about hearing from board members about governance and from the team about governance. So you want to think about that. And it also is a helpful way to get to the right person in governance, because then the PM will pretty much know who the person within that organization is the right individual to speak to.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Before we sort of talk about hot topics, I do have one other thing I want to discuss. And you mentioned about meeting with portfolio managers, meeting with different teams, but sort of what's the role of outside advisors in terms of, compensation consultants, investment banks, attorneys? How do they help the engagement process? I hear they're not actually in the room. So what do they do?
So I think Teresa said it very well. These are meetings where you don't want to go without having rehearsed and thought through carefully the topic. So I think part of what consultants can do and advisors can do, like bankers and comp consultants, is give the perspective of what has happened in a broader area of clients and organize a little bit of those thoughts, including teasing out some of the more problematic or tricky topics that can come up. If I were a general counsel of a company, I'd be a little bit uncomfortable asking the chair of my board something about succession or CEO succession or about board refreshment that maybe an outside advisor is much more accustomed to doing, right? So you want to play that role of playing devil's advocate, teasing out the topic, and also, quite frankly, I'm sure we've all done it in our careers in different roles, telling your client, look, I wouldn't answer it this way, or I think your answer probably opens up a lot more. I know you don't mean this, but it sounds like you're saying this, right? So playing a little bit more of a, test exam before the exam. But I would also say, genuinely, I do think a lot of people who participate in these meetings just get one chance once a year or every 2 years. And the benefit of us having a lot of reps in this and knowing what, investors care in these kind of times and what are the priorities for a specific team, say at BlackRock versus Vanguard versus Fidelity, is an important component of that dialogue. And so it's a little bit of rehearsal, prioritization, and also allows you to ask some of the smart questions, right? You sometimes have clients that keep on wondering about what is the real priority in the ESG framework, how much you index on the E, the S, the G is always important, but how much do you spend time based on your industry on the E and S? Well, you have a perfect forum to ask the people who ultimately matter, right? Not intermediaries who put out reports that might not influence anyone's view. You're asking directly the owners of that company, hey, where do you put more emphasis? Who's doing the right thing, and so on. So I think it's twofold. It's prep and making sure that you optimize that, but it also is setting yourself up to tease out the most valuable information that you can then report back to the full board and company and act on the basis of that info.
Yeah, I think that's important, that we serve, at least in the comp area and the governance area, as sort of a subject matter expert. So what we do is try to prepare the people who are going to be involved in the engagement for the questions that they're going to get, and making sure that they understand the issue and the context of the issue. The other thing that we do, and I'm sure that Alfredo's the same way, we're seeing this over a broad spectrum. So it's not like we're just dealing with one company. We're seeing this on all our clients. So we know what's happening out there in terms of what investors generally are looking for, what are the issues, what are the kinds of questions that are coming up. And that's information that you can help a team prepare for obviously on a no names basis, but to tell them that look, nobody knew this, but this issue now is something that's popped up in 4 or 5 companies. You ought to be prepared in case this happens to be number 6. So just acting as a conduit and being able to filter information and share it with the group before they go in can do a lot to make their presentation more effective.
Yeah. And, when I think about how to utilize consultants, outside counsel, certainly, as we've said a couple of times, they typically aren't the ones that, engage with the investor with you. But I've had situations where we use consultants to do what I call, what is called a vulnerability assessment. Where does the company stand in terms of, its potential for whether it's takeover or some other kind of significant activist approach. So we want to know that going in, kind of assessing, is there a perception of weakness? Where do we need to focus? Where do we, if we want to steer the meeting in a way where we can offset that or mitigate that perception, that vulnerability, what should we be talking about? And that goes to helping to develop the agenda. And also, we think about where's the company generally speaking? Have we heard from other activists or other shareholders before? And is it the same topic or is it a different topic? And maybe we need to become more aggressive with our outreach to investors. So having consultants kind of give you that external perspective. And to the earlier point, there may be a common theme going across a number of companies, whether it's industry or whether it's all companies. Sometimes as board and management, we are so inward focused, we don't have the time, nor do we have the capability of seeing what's going on more broadly so that we can see around the corner. So consultants can do that. They can tell us, listen, we've dealt with 20 other companies on this same issue. You haven't heard about it yet, but we want to tell you, and so that you can be prepared. And if you go out and do an outreach with one of your investors, you may hear about this. So they definitely serve a purpose in helping you get fully prepared for your meetings.
Thank you. Okay, so then let's talk about some of those issues and questions that are coming up in the meeting. So for all the panelists, sort of, what are the key issues that board should focus on during engagement, and what are investors wanting to discuss?
Well, I can start there. I'm sure we all have different views and partially overlapping ones. I think a lot of the focus these days is on the framework of governance. I think Teresa hinted to it earlier. Is everything sound? Does everything make sense? Or do you have to articulate, explain, clarify things based on what you're hearing? Number two, it's a little bit of thinking about the company as an evolving institution where you know what the business is today and what the strategy is today, and you have a board that is overseeing that strategy. Is that same board equipped to do that work going forward? And whether the answer is yes or no, how are you thinking about refreshment and new skills that you're bringing onto the board? I think the third one is highlighting what skills do exist and why shareholders need to kind of get comfort in the fact that those representatives on the board are able to act in their interest and make sure that nothing bad or horrible happens at the company, but also they make sure they optimize the positive, right? Because there's also that opportunity cost. If you have better people on the board or the right people on the board, you can do much better than you would otherwise. And then it is specific to, if you have a compensation matter, trying to hone in on that and explaining the philosophy that goes behind it. If you have other kind of, there's always some issues in production, supply chain, or something specific of the company that you are addressing it. And fundamentally, you're kind of presenting the group that is going to the investors as being, one, aware of what is broadly happening in the markets. Two, aware and direct and pretty honest about issues that are coming up. Again, you're not going to violate Reg FD, but you're not hiding things that investors care about under the rug, because that is not a good philosophy. Mm-hmm. And then the third one is also showing the people who are actually in charge, right? We very often, like to have, my CEO is famous for saying that he likes in-person meetings and goes to clients in person. And that is because we can identify, understand, and read a lot from the dynamics in the room of who's really calling the shots. Is that chairman of the board, the person who's deciding, or is it the CEO who's making all the decisions? Is that kind of head of sustainability aware of the latest trends or not? And so you give a chance to showcase the capabilities of the company ahead of anything bad happen, and you keep maintaining the trust of the investor in the fact that the company itself has identified the right people in various leadership roles to act on their own behalf.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one other topic that I've become aware of and that we've heard of is tenure. Our investors are looking at how long have these people been on your board, and if they think that the tenure has been excessive, then they may give them a no vote. So rotating is an issue that you should be talking about in your boardroom, and not rotating, but actually retirement. Because if most of your board has an average of 15 or 20 years, you may see that reflected in your investors' votes. So that's one issue. Another issue is, some of the political activities that are going on. More companies than before are starting to become vocal about certain political issues that may become an issue for your investors. So you definitely want to put your ear to the ground to see if that is something that may affect how they vote. And one thing that Alfredo mentioned was skill sets. Are the skill sets of your board members suitable for your future strategy? If they look through the descriptions of what your board members do and, what skills they bring to the table, it may not be what your investors think you need to run that company and to execute on that strategy. So you may hear about that. And I would suggest if you're a board member and your company hasn't done that, be very innovative or clear about how your board how their skill sets match up against your strategy, because investors are starting to really parse through that. Years ago, that wasn't quite as important, but it's becoming much more important today, especially as technology changes. Technology is becoming more embedded in companies, and companies where it wasn't a thought, and another one is AI disclosure. That's another one that that investors are saying, hey, what are your policies on AI? Is it creating risks in terms of privacy? Is it allowing you on the upside, are you exploiting it so that you can create shareholder value, so downside and upside risks. So those are some things that are coming to the attention.
Just two disclosure points, and Teresa's already alluded to one of them. It used to be you had to disclose who was on the board. Today, you have to disclose why they're on the board.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of backgrounds that you need for the business strategy and the objectives that you have. There's a skills matrix that has to be provided in your proxy statement, so somebody can see very easily whether or not you have people in the areas that are critical to the development and growth of your business. Plus, in the biographies, you have to include a statement saying, why is so-and-so on the board? What do they bring to the table generally that is going to be valuable to us? The other thing to keep in mind too, in the exec comp area, is that if you fail say on pay, or if you receive significant opposition to your say on pay proposal, which generally depends, it's 20 to 30% no votes. The proxy advisory firms expect that you will discuss your reaction to that in your subsequent proxy statement, including describing the process that you used to reach out to investors and the particulars about that, who was involved, how many did you contact, how many responded, what was the feedback that you received, but most importantly, what was your response to that feedback? That's now, it's not a requirement from the SEC, but it is an implicit requirement from the proxy advisory firms. We've had clients who have received an unfavorable recommendation the following year because they didn't disclose that they had done anything based on the input that they'd received in the prior year. So they take it very seriously, and that's now become a critical part of your disclosure. How it's not only that you engage, but discussing your engagement and what came out of it.
And maybe one quick thing before we move on. I don't want to steal the thunder of the next panel, so I'll not talk too much about activism, but I think one important thing, tenure and skills become extremely important in the universal proxy contest, right? Mm-hmm. Where you have individuals pitted against each other, strongest activist perceived candidate versus weakest board perceived candidate. And so thinking about those factors, both in normal course, but also in terms of activism risk is an important component, because you never want to have a situation where you're not able to justify why that director is additive, because you're setting yourself up to have a target on the back of that director, or you don't want to have someone who has a 30-year tenure, because guess what? The activists will probably target that person, because it's an easier thing to explain that if the performance has not been stellar, it might have something to do with the person who's been on the board 30 years versus 1 year.
Couple other quick things. Inbound engagement is something you ought to have covered by your particular program. If you get an activist investor, if you get someone who you know has a specific issue, invite them in to talk to you. Don't wait until you reach out to them. The other thing too is we're on the cusp of some of the major investment or the investment management firms beginning to start giving the vote preferences to their shareholders, to their investors. So it's not as easy as it used to be, or soon won't be as easy as it used to be, to predict what a investor how they may react to a particular proposal or a particular item if that decision starts getting filtered down to the individual investors. So that's something to kind of be mindful of.
Right. So I think this is probably a good point, since we have about 15 minutes left, to pause for a moment and see what questions you might have for our panelists. The microphone here. Either get it ready.
Well, first of all, let me thank the panel for this great discussion. You've given so many practical tips and guidance that you can tangibly use every day. I had a question relative to this notion about interest in compensation, and so this whole compensation discussion. And you talked about rule say on pay. From the perspective of shareholders, are they really interested in just kind of their own increase in shareholder value for them? Are they interested in really the compensation structure that's going to really further the growth of the business, retain the best talent, be fair to the talent? I mean, I've got a situation with the board that I won't say who, but there's a need to do a reset in the equity standing because of just the volatility of the market. And, there's a thought that the shareholders may just be looking at this from the standpoint of any reset like that could diminish the value, their value, as opposed to, look, we need to keep the best talent, we need to keep the talent engaged, and we need to motivate them to do their best work going forward. So I hope that's clear. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I could talk about that for days, but I won't. I think this is where relationships prove to be helpful, because you do need to make sure that investors understand and appreciate the tension that you have between keeping costs down, and particularly today, recruiting talent. If I regret anything in my life, it's that I didn't go to school to be an AI person, because I'd be retired by now. So yeah, that's something that you have to focus on. And I think the key there is trying to ensure or be able to articulate your position. And it should be something that's ongoing. It's not just a one and done type thing. The other thing that I'll mention here too, just so I don't forget it, because I think it's really key, having worked for over 20 years in helping companies write their CD&As, it used to be that you could just give kind of a cursory explanation of how your incentive compensation programs work. It doesn't cut it anymore. Investors are digging down. They want to know, okay, why did you select this particular metric? How does it, further our particular business objectives? There's been a big push against non-GAAP metrics. Why are you using them? How do you calculate this? And what would the effect be if you use the GAAP version rather than the non-GAAP version? So we're finding that in this explaining, first of all, you're going through this with the comp committee ahead of time so that these are the questions or the touch points that we want to cover in our disclosure. And this is starting to become the expectation because the proxy advisory firms and the big institutional investors, they're as familiar with how plans work as we are. Now they're drilling down into the substance and want to know, is this truly effective? And if you believe that it is, explain why.
No. I don't have anything.
So in the latest SEC rulings on cyber, they did not require a cyber expert on the board. Can you just talk to philosophy and trends for skills that need to be on the board versus topics that need to be on the board agenda?
I can address that
Mhm.
just from a nom and gov chair perspective. Correct, not every company needs a cyber person or a tech expert on their board. You have to think about first, what's the strategy of the company, the future strategy, what's happening externally within the industry, what's important for us to be competitive. And so if we need someone in cyber, for example, at one of the companies where I'm on the board, we have a great CISO. And they come in and they talk to us, almost every meeting. You can get outside consultants, just to make sure you're appropriately calibrated. The most important thing, as I said, is, what's our risk profile? What is our strategy? And that kind of creates what kind of skill sets we necessarily need on the board. What was the second part of your question,
It
however?
was just on the board versus in the board or on the board agenda. So
Yeah,
on the board-
yeah. So as I said, taking the cyber as an example, we make sure that cyber is always on the agenda. And also we make sure that, does the board need to go out and do what I call kick the tires? If there's a particular thing going on, do we need to take the board on a field trip to see and hear specifically what's going on? If there's something fundamental to our strategy and fundamental to the industry that we're in, then certainly we need a board member on the board that has that skill set. Because that is so inherent in what we do and who we are. And that's always going to be, for example, a big risk. And that's how I think about, the skill sets that need to be on the board. There was a moment when cyber first became a thing and everybody thought they needed a cyber expert on the board and quickly found out, no, that's not necessary. Did that answer your question? Sure.
So we got
So I-
Nicole and David.
I thought I had the mic. Hello, my name is Brittany McCants, and I'm a Barnes and Thornburg Executive Compensation Partner. I kind of wanted to go back to the individuals who are in the room with the shareholders. And so thus far, we've seen with the rollbacks with ESG that when the first comment everyone makes is, well, I'm not surprised that this is because both the working base and the shareholder base are in alignment. So if you were in the space where you're being asked to address a change in your comp structure or, like adding in an ESG modifier or not, and it's something that's going to be a tension between your employee base and your shareholder base, or a better example, I guess, would be if the CEO's compensation is up for question based on the metrics, who's best suited to be in the room addressing those? Or is the better approach to have it be more of a listening meeting and then use your disclosure to communicate a message versus trying to kind of be on the defense or offense, if that makes sense?
Can I reframe the question? Are you asking who should be at the meeting? If you, for example, have a question and a lack of alignment between shareholder and employees around compensation?
Yes, specifically, so I would think that because you said that it's not the compensation committee members that are in that meeting. I'm just thinking if it's the CEO, the CFO.
It may
be.
very well
may
be.
be.
It-
It may be.
it would
And
be-
so, yeah, the question is around, is that something that is there a lot of thought and process going into which person in that specific meeting is going to address it? And are there better people? Like, is the compensation consultant or compensation advisor better than having management address that in some ways? Or is it just such a nuanced analysis that?
No,
Yeah.
not at all. If you know going into the meeting, either you've had feedback through the say on pay vote, shareholder proposals, or other things, I think it's incumbent upon management and the board to put the compensation committee chair on the group. And hopefully that person is in a position where they're articulate and can state the case.
And the head
for
of
the
HR.
committee. And the head of HR, yeah. And we want those, we want that individual there, and the companies or the investors want to see them too. I mean, it's very difficult to write a CD&A and say, well, we had 6 different comp issues, but for some reason we didn't provide anybody who knows anything about comp in our engagement team.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
it's going to differ. Governance now is becoming the same thing. So NomGov
Mhm.
becomes a little bit more important. But the key thing here is, and I think Alfredo touched on this, you got to know, which investors want to hear from management and members of the board, and which one just, don't want to interact with the board. I'd say that is shrinking, but that's still a consideration. But I think the kinds of issues you're talking about, the best person to state the company's position is going to be someone from the relevant committee.
Mhm.
And it's the ultimate decision maker, if you think about it, right? Management proposes, they have the benefit of consultants giving them benchmarking. But that person and the committee in general and the board, after recommendation for a committee, needs to make a decision whether they go left or right. And those people should be able to articulate to the investors how they thought about it, explain the issues. They don't have to be experts like Mark is of compensation matters, but they need to have a layman's understanding to be able to say, yeah, we thought about that. However, we did this because, so it's a bit of that dialogue. And you want those people to be part of that meeting,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And the last thing I would say on this, and I know we're running out of time, is rarely will, at least in my opinion, rarely would you want to have an external expert in there. You use them for prep purposes, make sure that you've explored all the angles of that particular issue and that you're literate going in. But the investors want to talk to the company and the board, not to your consultant.
I've yet to meet a portfolio manager who wanted to talk to me.
We'll find one, don't worry, we'll find one.
I'll add briefly from the research that my co-author and I did for responses, especially on low say on pay votes. We were surprised. The proxy advisors wanted you to disclose who was in these meetings.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And we were surprised by the number of firms that did not
Mm.
provide that disclosure. And based on what you're saying, it sounds like one key takeaway is maybe let all investors know that the comp committee chair or whomever was at the company.
It's
was present.
become, I mean, again, because we're talking about an evolving practice, it's becoming more and more apparent that specificity around the process is important, particularly when you have an issue that is one that is going to need to be discussed in the proxy statement, so that, to be as transparent as possible, you need to kind of be able to say, well, the 2 things that I abide by are, 1, who was in the meeting is important, as well as what was our response. Even if you decide we're not going to make a change and give away automobiles to all of our shareholders, you need to explain why.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So we probably have about 2 minutes. We can take one more question, Priya or Mike, either one.
Yeah, I'm curious, after these engagement calls, what's the dialogue between the PMs and the governance team? And is there ever a disconnect? And, what, does anyone pull weight and when and why?
They do certainly talk and sync up. I've seen all kinds of scenarios, full alignment, disconnect, kind of complete, difference of views. In general, in the more active managers, when there's a difference of views, unless there's a firm policy thematic, the PM tends to prevail.
Mhm.
Because ultimately they view that, the PM will have factored in the governance thematics, but ultimately the analysis of the performance of the business, the outlook of the business is what matters.
Mhm.
At the index funds, you don't have that problem.
Mhm.
But there's some institutions that will say if there's a deadlock, then the two people have to figure it out and then come up with a joint recommendation. But you can see all sorts of iterations there. Key is to try to stay away from those. Obviously, you cannot change your nature to appease everyone, but that is why spending time in the prep, thinking through what the issues are and how to address them in a coherent way is very important. And also understanding who's more experienced and versed in the specifics of your business versus not. And so maybe starting the meeting and giving everyone kind of a lay of the land that is cognizant of where you think that disagreement might be or where the difference of views might be, so that they're all working from the same facts. Because someone who covers thousands of companies from a governance standpoint will never understand why your margin is 20% versus 22%.
Right.
So you gotta help them get to the same point.
So we'll end at that. I want to thank our panelists for offering the feedback and comments today, and thank you for your questions. I appreciate it.